Policy Agreement 2 between the two parties. Election fraud. This one is a tough one. Not because there's a lack of evidence to support the idea that there is election fraud in the United States, but because it goes against the core beliefs of many Americans that their election system is honest, open, fair, and accurate. Sometimes people who hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it's so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief. At this point, though, we want to distinguish between election fraud and voter fraud, since many people are confused about the two. Voter fraud is when you vote in an illegal way. One example includes voting if you're not a citizen. Another example of voter fraud would be if you live with your mom, both ballots arrive in the mail, you open up both your ballot and your mom's ballot, and you vote for both of you, forge her signature, and turn in both ballots, thus getting 2 votes for yourself. This is obviously illegal, but it's not very common. Getting people motivated enough to vote once is difficult enough. By contrast, however, election fraud is when you tamper with the election system in some way, such as rigging voting machines, purging voters from the rolls, changing vote totals in the database, rounding up and rounding down the number of votes for a specific candidate, and more. How easy is it to rig an election anyway? Well, it all adds up. Part 1. Soft election fraud. What do we mean by soft election fraud? This would include any process which would make the election unfair in some way, but not so direct as to tamper with vote totals or databases, or anything like that. This could include examples such as manipulated media coverage, cutting the number of polling places, long waits in line to vote, long waits between registering to vote and being able to vote, requiring party registration in order to vote, and more. Let's use a specific example. Democratic Party superdelegates. What are superdelegates? In the presidential primaries in the Democratic Party, when you go to vote, around 85% of the delegates to the DNC convention, where the final candidate is chosen to be the presidential nominee, are representative of the voters. However, around 15% of these delegates that choose the presidential nominee are superdelegates. These are party officials, lobbyists, former governors, congressmen, who have been chosen by party insiders to be delegates. What is the purpose of these superdelegates? It's to make sure that the Democratic Party remains in control of the insiders and party bosses so that no grassroots movement can take over the party. Former DNC chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz admitted as much during the 2016 election. She was DNC chair at the time.
Hillary Clinton lost to Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire by 22 percentage points, the biggest victory in a contested Democratic primary there since John F. Kennedy. But it looks as though Clinton and Sanders are leaving the granite state with the same number of delegates in their pockets because Clinton has the support of New Hampshire's superdelegates, these party insiders. What do you tell voters who are new to the process who says this makes them feel like it's all rigged?
Well, let me just make sure that I can clarify exactly what was available during the primaries in Iowa and in New Hampshire. The unpledged delegates are a separate category. The only thing available on the ballot in a primary and a caucus is the pledged delegates, those that are tied to the candidate that they are pledged to support, and they receive a proportional number of delegates going into our convention. Unpledged delegates exist really to make sure that party leaders and elected officials don't have to be in a position where they are running against grassroots activists. Unpledged delegates exist really to make sure that party leaders and elected officials don't have to be in a position where they are running against grassroots activists. We are, as a Democratic Party, really highlight and emphasize inclusiveness and diversity at our convention, and so we want to give every opportunity to grassroots activists and diverse, committed Democrats to be able to participate, attend, and be a delegate at the convention. And so we separate out those unpledged delegates to make sure that there isn't competition between them.
I'm not sure that answer would satisfy an anxious young voter, but
Superdelegates have been part of the Democratic Party presidential primary process since 1984. However, the origins of the superdelegates go back further. With the 1968 Democratic National Convention, pro-Vietnam War liberal Hubert Humphrey was nominated for the presidency despite not running in a single primary election or caucus. The Democratic Party made changes in its delegate selection process to correct what primary voters saw as unfair control of the nomination process by party bosses. The McGovern-Fraser Commission, headed by South Dakota Senator George McGovern and Minnesota Representative Donald M. Fraser, met in 1969 and 1970 and shifted the balance of power to primary elections and caucuses, mandating that all delegates be chosen via mechanisms open to all party members. The Democrats proved largely unsuccessful at the ballot box, however, with the 1972 presidential campaign of McGovern and the 1980 re-election campaign of Jimmy Carter, which both resulted in landslide defeats. A new 70-member commission headed by North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt was appointed to further change the Democratic Party's nomination process, attempting to balance the wishes of rank-and-file Democrats with the collective wisdom of party leaders, and to thereby avoid the nomination of an insurgent candidate. Following a series of meetings held from August 1981 to February 1982, the Hunt Commission recommended the idea of superdelegates. With the original Hunt plan, superdelegates were to represent 30% of all delegates to the National Convention. But when it was actually implemented by the Democratic National Committee for the 1984 election, the number of superdelegates was set at around 14%. Over time, this percentage has gradually increased, until by 2008, the percentage stood at approximately 20% of total delegates to the Democratic Party nominating convention. What is the problem with superdelegates? Well, they make up anywhere from 15 to 20% of the primary vote when deciding who presidential nominee for the Democratic Party will be. This could easily swing an election against the will of the voters. Many elections are within a 15% margin. When it really matters, the superdelegates can tip the scales in favor of party insiders. This, in our view, is soft election fraud. On the Republican side, we have winner-take-all primaries, which is different than the Democratic Party. This means that delegates chosen to go to the National Republican Convention are chosen based on who won the state rather than proportional representation. This means that if you won the state, whatever state it is, by a 51-49% election where you won by 1% as a presidential candidate, you'd receive 100% of the delegates from that state. Instead, on the Democratic Party side, where you'd receive 51% of the delegates from that state instead of 100%, minus the superdelegate. Why is winner-take-all a bad system in terms of the election of presidential candidates? Because it does not give a fair representation of the will of the voters. Since a presidential candidate gets 100% of the delegates in a state where they won by 1% of the vote, that means that 49% of the residents from this very same state, hypothetically, don't have their voices heard. Let's move on to another example, controlling the presidential debates. For many Americans who don't follow politics or government operations very closely, the presidential debates are sometimes the first and only time that citizens will hear and get to know each of the presidential candidates and debate policy issues. This is why both the Democrats and the Republicans work together, literally, to control the presidential debate process. How do they do this? Through the Commission on Presidential Debates. The Commission on Presidential Debates, or CPD, is an independent nonprofit organization established in 1987. Their operations are funded jointly by both political parties. Since both parties fund the CPD, they effectively have a monopoly over the presidential debate process. Both parties have used this to to keep third-party candidates out of the debates. In the year 2000, the CPD established a rule that for a candidate to be included in the national debates, they must have at least 15% support across 5 national polls. In 2003, a nonprofit organization called Open Debates was formed to advocate for debates that included third parties and allowed exchanges amongst the candidates. Open Debates criticized the CPD for collusion between the two political parties. One example includes the 2012 election where the Romney campaign and the Obama campaign signed a contract with the CPD called a Memo of Understanding, which informed both candidates of the debate topics in advance, who would host them, and set strict rules for the candidates, such as not being able to ask direct questions of the other candidate, seating arrangements, what questions will and will not be asked, and more. On October 8th, 2004, 2 presidential candidates, Libertarian candidate Michael Badnarik and Green Party candidate David Cobb, were arrested while protesting the Commission on Presidential Debates for excluding third-party candidates from the nationally televised debates in St. Louis, Missouri. On October 16th, 2012, Green Party presidential nominee Jill Stein and Green Party vice presidential nominee Sherry Honkala were arrested for disorderly conduct while trying to take part in the second presidential debate in Hempstead, New York. The 2 women were taken to a warehouse and for around 8 hours were strapped to chairs with plastic wrist restraints before being released. The CPD has had multiple lawsuits filed against them as well. In the 2000 election, Green Party candidate Ralph Nader filed a complaint with the FEC on the basis that corporate contributions to the CPD violate the Federal Election Campaign Act. The FEC ruled that the CPD's funding sources did not violate the Federal Election Campaign Act. In 2012, Libertarian presidential candidate Gary Johnson filed an antitrust lawsuit against the CPD, citing the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case was dismissed in 2014 by the D.C. Circuit Court. In September 2015, the Libertarian and Green parties filed another lawsuit against the CPD, the Democratic National Committee, the Republican National Committee, Barack Obama, and Mitt Romney, citing violation of federal antitrust laws. The case was dismissed in August 2016. By controlling the debate process, the 2 major parties have been able to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow a very lively debate within that spectrum. This is why the policies, debate topics, and types of candidates never change, and the general public doesn't hear very many new ideas from their elected officials. Let's move on to another example of soft election fraud: legalized bribery, also known as money in politics. This has been a problem in American politics for quite some time, but has accelerated in recent years with the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission Supreme Court decision in 2010, which opened the door for unlimited election spending by corporations to super PACs. The ruling brought a new era of corporate influence in politics, allowing companies, business people, and billionaires to buy elections to promote their financial interests. When corporations and governments mix, both become corrupted, not just the government, both. This is why politicians, especially at the national level, don't actually implement policies to benefit the people. They implement policies to benefit their donors. That's why politicians that take money from the health insurance industry don't want universal health care. That's why politicians that take money from the oil companies don't implement practical environmental policies. It's why almost all of the politicians are pro-war, because they're all receiving some money from military companies or billionaires that support the military. All these politicians have already been bought out. There are countless examples. Bribing politicians is a form of soft election fraud. Both parties agree that it's okay because they both represent corporations and billionaires and their financial interests. And corporations and billionaires want to continue to buy out the political process even further. Billionaire Warren Buffett even went so far as to say that the billionaire class has won the class war.
About millionaires, about the uber rich paying their fair share of taxes. But since the portion of their taxes really isn't going to make a huge dent in the deficit, are you happy seeing your suggestion, this new Buffett rule, becoming more of a basis of a political battle that really has turned into class warfare?
Well, no, actually, there's been class warfare going on for the last 20 years, and my class is one. We're the ones that have gotten our tax rates reduced dramatically.
Let's take a look at another form of soft election fraud, manipulated media coverage. In 1983, 90% of U.S. media was owned by 50 companies. Now 90% of U.S. media is controlled by 6 giant media companies. These 6 companies are General Electric, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. These media companies and their various owners also give money to political campaigns from both political parties. This is a major conflict of interest. It means a company like Comcast, who owns NBC, can give money to a political campaign for their preferred candidate, and then use their media influence to trick the public and cover an election in a manipulated way in order to get their preferred candidate to win. And then once their preferred candidate does win, the politician can turn around and pass laws and policies that benefit the company who just buttered them up, Comcast. A recent example of this happened during the 2016 Democratic primary when MSNBC's Chris Matthews said that they would announce Hillary Clinton the winner in California primary before the polls even closed.
Trouble. I'm about to start here. I'm told by the experts on numbers around here at NBC and elsewhere that come June 7th, the day of the California primary, which your candidate, I totally understand, wants to get to and maybe have a chance of knocking off Hillary at that event, a big last hurrah, that at 8 o'clock that night Eastern time, the networks will be prepared, including this one, to announce that Hillary Clinton has now gotten over the top, that she will have won the nomination in numbers. It's done. What will that do to turnout if that's 5 o'clock Pacific time with 3 more hours to vote in California? Who will be least likely to vote? Sanders people from 5 to 8 people or Hillary? I've heard both theories.
Well, I think
your candidate?
Well, I think it'll depress turnout on both sides. Whenever there's no contest, I think you get depressed turnout on both sides. But it'll be an inaccurate description of the state of the race.
The major corporate media companies will also use a technique known as astroturfing. In other words, fake grassroots movements and organizations for the purposes of manipulating the public to support one position or another. Investigative journalist and former CBS employee Cheryl Atkinson explains how astroturfing, funded by political, corporate, and other special interests.
So, consider this fictitious example that's inspired by real life. Say you're watching the news and you see a story about a new study on the cholesterol-lowering drug called Cholextra. The study says Cholextra is so effective that doctors should consider prescribing it to adults and even children who don't yet have high cholesterol. Is it too good to be true? You're smart, you decide to do some of your own research. You do a Google search, you consult social media, Facebook and Twitter, you look at Wikipedia, WebMD, a nonprofit website, and you read the original study in a peer-reviewed published medical journal. It all confirms how effective Cholextra is. You do run across a few negative comments and a potential link to cancer, but you dismiss that because medical experts call the cancer link a myth and say that those who think there is a link there are quacks and cranks and nuts. Finally, you learn that your own doctor recently attended a medical seminar. The lecture that he attended confirmed how effective Cholextra is, so he sends you off with some free samples and a prescription. You've really done your homework. But what if all isn't as it seems? What if the reality you found was false? A carefully constructed narrative by unseen special interests designed to manipulate your opinion. A Truman Show-esque alternate reality all around you. Complacency in the news media combined with incredibly powerful propaganda and publicity forces mean we sometimes get little of the truth. Special interests have unlimited time and money to figure out new ways to spin us while cloaking their role. Surreptitious astroturf methods are now more important to these interests than traditional lobbying of Congress. There's an entire industry built around it in Washington. What is astroturf? It's a perversion of grassroots, as in fake grassroots. AstroTurf is when political, corporate, or other special interests disguise themselves and publish blogs, start Facebook and Twitter accounts, publish ads, letters to the editor, or simply post comments online to try to fool you into thinking an independent or grassroots movement is speaking. The whole point of AstroTurf is to try to give the impression there's widespread support for or against an agenda when there's not. AstroTurf seeks to manipulate you into changing your opinion by making you feel as if you're an outlier when you're not. One example is the Washington Redskins name. Without taking a position on the controversy, if you simply were looking at news media coverage over the course of the past year or looking at social media, you'd probably have to conclude that most Americans find that name offensive and think it ought to be changed. But what if I told you 71% of Americans say the name should not be changed? That's more than 2/3. AstroTurfers seek to controversialize those who disagree with them. They attack news organizations that publish stories they don't like, whistleblowers who tell the truth, politicians who dare to ask the tough questions, and journalists who have the audacity to report on all of it. Sometimes AstroTurfers simply shove intentionally so much confusing and conflicting information into the mix that you're left to throw up your hands and disregard all of it, including the truth. Drown out a link between a medicine and a harmful side effect, say vaccines and autism, by throwing a bunch of conflicting paid-for studies, surveys, and experts into the mix, confusing the truth beyond recognition. Let's now go back to that fictitious Colextra example and all the research you did. It turns out the Facebook and Twitter accounts you found that were so positive were actually written by paid professionals hired by the drug company to promote the drug. The Wikipedia page had been monitored by an agenda editor also paid by the drug company. The drug company also arranged to optimize Google search engine results, so it was no accident that you stumbled across that positive nonprofit that had all those positive comments. The nonprofit was, of course, secretly founded and funded by the drug company. The drug company also financed that positive study and used its power of editorial control to omit any mention of cancer as a possible side effect. Once more, each and every doctor who publicly touted Colextra or called the cancer link a myth, or ridiculed critics as paranoid cranks and quacks, or served on a government advisory board that approved the drug, each of those doctors is actually a paid consultant for the drug company. As for your own doctor, the medical lecture he attended that had all those positive evaluations was, in fact, like many continuing medical education classes, sponsored by the drug company. And when the news reported on that positive study, it didn't mention any of that. I have tons of personal examples from real life. A couple of years ago, CBS News asked me to look into a story about a study coming out from the nonprofit National Sleep Foundation. Supposedly, this press release coming out said, the study concluded we're a nation with an epidemic of sleeplessness and we don't even know it, and we should all go ask our doctors about it. A couple of things struck me about that. First, I recognized the phrase, ask your doctor, as a catchphrase promoted by the pharmaceutical industry. They know that if they can get your foot through the door of the doctor's office to mention a malady, you're very likely to be prescribed the latest drug that's marketed. Second, I wondered how serious an epidemic of sleeplessness could really be if we don't even know that we have it. Right? It didn't take long for me to do a little research and discover that the National Sleep Foundation nonprofit and the study, which was actually a survey, not a study, were sponsored in part by a new drug that was about to be launched onto the market called Lunesta, a sleeping pill. I reported the study as CBS News asked, but of course I disclosed the sponsorship behind the nonprofit and the survey so that viewers could weigh the information accordingly. All the other news media reported the same survey directly off the press release as written without digging past the superficial. It later became an example written up in the Columbia Journalism Review, which quite accurately reported that only we at CBS News had bothered to do a little bit of research and disclose the conflict of interest behind this widely reported survey. So now you may be thinking, what can I do? I thought I'd done my research. What chance do I have separating fact from fiction, especially if seasoned journalists with years of experience can be so easily fooled? Well, I have a few strategies that I can tell you about to help you recognize signs of propaganda and AstroTurf. Once you start to know what to look for, you'll begin to recognize it everywhere. First, hallmarks of AstroTurf include use of inflammatory language such as crank, quack, nutty, lies, paranoid, pseudo, and conspiracy. AstroTurfers often claim to debunk myths that aren't myths at all. Use of the charged language tests well. People hear something's a myth, maybe they find it on Snopes, and they instantly declare themselves too smart to fall for it. But what if the whole notion of the myth is itself a myth, and you and Snopes fell for that? Beware when interests attack an issue by controversializing or attacking the people, personalities, and organizations surrounding it rather than addressing the facts. That could be AstroTurf. And most of all, AstroTurfers tend to reserve all of their public skepticism for those exposing wrongdoing rather than the wrongdoers. In other words, instead of questioning authority, they question those who question authority. You might start to see things a little more clearly. It's kind of like taking off your glasses and wiping them and putting them back on and realizing for the first time how foggy they'd been all along. I can't resolve these issues, but I hope that I've given you some information that will at least motivate you to take off your glasses and wipe them and become a wiser consumer of information in an increasingly artificial, paid-for reality.
With enough time, money, and effort, giant media companies are able to construct an artificial reality for many people. An early pioneer of media manipulation in the United States was Edward Bernays. In this 2002 documentary known as Century of the Self, Adam Curtis describes the technique of Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's American nephew, in terms of media manipulation in the United States. Propaganda was replaced with quote-unquote public relations.
In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire led Europe into war. As the horror mounted, Freud saw it as terrible evidence of the truth of his findings. The saddest thing, he wrote, is that this is exactly the way we should have expected people to behave, from our knowledge of psychoanalysis. Governments had unleashed the primitive forces in human beings, and no one seemed to know how to stop them. At that time, Freud's young nephew, Edward Bernays, was working as a press agent in America. His main client was the world-famous opera singer Caruso, who was touring the United States. Bernays' parents had emigrated to America 20 years before, but he kept in touch with his uncle and joined him for holidays in the Alps. But Bernays was now about to return to Europe for a very different reason. On the night that Caruso opened in Toledo, Ohio, America announced it was entering the war against Germany and Austria. As a part of the war effort, the US government set up a Committee on Public Information, and Bernays was employed to promote America's war aims in the press. The president, Woodrow Wilson, had announced that the United States would fight not to restore the old empires, but to bring democracy to all of Europe. And Bernays proved extremely skillful in promoting this idea, both at home and abroad. And at the end of the war, he was asked to accompany the president to the Paris Peace Conference.
Then, to my surprise, they asked me to go over with Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference. And at the age of 26, I was in Paris for the entire time of the peace conference that was held in the suburb of Paris, and we worked to make the world safe for democracy. That was a big slogan.
Wilson's reception in Paris astounded Bernays and the other American propagandists. Their propaganda had portrayed Wilson as a liberator of the people, a man who would create a new world in which the individual would be free. They had made him a hero of the masses. And as he watched the crowd surge around Wilson, Bernays began to wonder whether it would be possible to do the same type of mass persuasion, but in peacetime.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Bernays returned to New York and set up as a public relations counsel in a small office off Broadway. It was the first time the term had ever been used. Since the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. And he wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
What Eddie got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision-making, not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie knew that was not the way the world worked.
In the modern era, these techniques are even more sophisticated. Social media, like Facebook, for example, has computer algorithms that are able to measure patterns of thought online and use that data to manipulate what people see and hear. The algorithms can also be set up to organize people into bubbles, where you don't work together with other groups, and where you only see posts from things you like and block things you don't like. Every time you like something or block somebody, you're giving the machine more information. That information can be used in a countless number of ways. It still hasn't fully played out yet. Part 2. Hard election fraud. Rigged voting machines.
Well, let me tell you what we're going to do today. We have constructed a mini election, but Harry Hersey, as you have served as a technical advisor of how to do this, we're going to ask you to remain outside. After you, let me introduce you to my election staff. To ensure that we have not prepared some sort of a device that has been pre-rigged, pick the number, and then we'll grab that unit, and that will be the device that we will count the ballots on.
I just feel like this is the one.
Okay, and the winner is unit 15191.
5191.
What we have here is a programmed optical scan ballot. There is only one question on this ballot. Can the votes on the Diebold system be hacked using the memory card?
I have only touched the memory card, not the other parts of the Diebold election system, which is going to be used today. Only the memory card.
And I can certainly speak for myself and Harry, and that we're going to vote yes.
All right, then let's have the rest of us vote no. Two individuals, Hugh and Harry, will be voting yes. The rest of us will be voting no. And then we'll scrutinize the ballots afterwards to ensure that that is indeed the mark.
I will say that I'm wrong and Diebold is right, and I'm going to say no, they cannot be hacked.
It's impossible. So I vote no.
I'm going to film myself voting. Excuse me.
I'm going to mark this ballot no. Dr. Thompson?
I am going to bar this ballot yes. I've seen some pretty concerning things.
Well, it's down to you. You're the last voter, Harry.
All right. I think it could be. So I vote for yes.
You will be the second yes.
All right, Ian, here is the memory card I have touched.
Okay. Now, this is the only piece of Diebold equipment that you've used.
That's correct.
Well, thank you. Let me take your ballot in. This card will go into this slot. The next activity that the election worker does on the morning of the election is turn the machine on, making it live to receive votes. When you do that, this machine will produce what is called a zero total tape. The machine is going through a self-test analysis, and then it'll spontaneously turn on. This is Harry's card that is telling us that there are 0 votes stored in the memory. Okay, let me get the ballots. Let's insert a yes ballot. We're going to put in another no. 7. And the last no ballot, 8. Placing the ender card in this device and telling it to turn off its counting function and do its reporting function will now cause the voting machine to print out a tape reading the number of votes that it had just read. Oh my.
Oh, what is it? Oh no! What is it? What is it? 7 yes, 1 no. Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Let me see.
Here's the tape.
7 people said it could be hacked.
And we put through 6 and 2.
6
no's
no's
and 2
2
yes.
yeses.
Oh my gosh, do you know what this means?
How do we know that Harry didn't just change the report and the votes themselves on the memory card are still correct? If that was the case, when they go into GEMS, the results would be different, isn't that right?
I mean, the only way to know that is to read them into GEMS and to check the vote totals.
See what GEMS says. So should we do that?
I think we should, because I want to confirm for my own analysis, is this just a superficial
Right, that's a good
hack? In other words,
question.
did we just change the words on this paper? And we will upload this memory card if I had not seen what was behind this, I'd have no reason not to. I would have certified this election as a true and accurate result of a vote.
Susan, what does this mean for you?
It makes me cry. I'm sorry, but it does.
Why? Why?
There's so many reasons. The reasons because there are people out there who are giving their lives to try to make our elections secure, and they're being called conspiracy theorists and technophobes, and these vendors are lying and saying that everything's all right, and it's not all right. And I'm crying because it's, I'll quote somebody that I know who said that it's as though our country's one country pretending to be another country. How can this be happening to our elections? This really does affect me.
I don't know exactly how to describe what I saw here. I think we, as election officials, need to be a little bit more demanding from the vendors as to the technical specifications of this equipment. The vendors are driving the process of voting technology in the United States. I would much rather, at this point, I think, focus on allowing citizens to select technology that satisfies their needs.
This isn't just theoretical, though. There are real-life examples. Clint Curtis is an American attorney, computer programmer, and ex-employee of NASA and ExxonMobil. He's notable for making a series of whistleblower allegations about his former employer, Yang Enterprises, and about Republican Congressman Tom Feeney. In 2000, Feeney and Yang Enterprises requested Curtis's assistance in a scheme to steal votes by inserting fraudulent code into the touchscreen voting systems. Curtis testified under oath on the matter.
Mr. Curtis, are there programs that can be used to secretly fix elections?
Yes.
How do you know that to be the case?
Because in October of 2000, I wrote a prototype for President Congressman Tom Feeney at the company I worked for in Oviedo, Florida, that did just that.
And would that program that you designed be something that elections officials could detect?
They'd never see it.
And your testimony is under oath?
Yes, sir.
And the testimony you've given is true?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
In 2000, I was working for Yang Enterprises, which was a company in Oviedo, Florida, and their chief lobbyist, their corporate attorney, and Speaker of the House of Florida was Tom Feeney.
Tom Feeney was the general counsel and registered lobbyist for Yang Enterprises, even while he was Speaker of the Florida House.
He came in one day, one of my first introductions to him, and he wanted us to build a vote flipping software.
He was asked by Tom Feeney to create essentially a vote rigging software prototype.
My interpretation initially was that he wanted to prevent you evil Democrats, because I was a Republican, from cheating. So we know how bad you are. So, he's a Republican, I'm a Republican, which, immediately makes him the good guy right away. So obviously he's not going to try and, steal votes. He wanted it to run on a Windows platform, be touchscreen capable. He wanted it to not have any additional hardware, so you didn't have to bring in a keyboard, you didn't have to sit across the street in a truck. You could just sit there and punch a button, and the votes all flip. And the third thing he wanted was that he wanted it so that in the source code, you could not see the fact that it was being flipped. Well, not only you shouldn't be doing that, but you can't do that. You cannot hide in the source code. Done deal. I can't do it. Nobody else can either.
Tom Feeney is best known for being the guy in the 2000 election. No matter what the Supreme Court decided, he was going to assure that the electoral votes went to George W. Bush. He had previously, in 1994, been the running mate to Jeb Bush in Jeb's initial bid for governor in Florida, which he lost.
So I built it for him, gave it to Mrs. Yang along with the sheet on how you prevent vote fraud. She said, "You don't understand. In order to get this contract, we have to hide the vote fraud in the source code. This is to flip the vote in South Florida." Which, I'm thinking, what are you, a crook?
We can only assume that that's what Feeney told her. For some reason, that's what she felt, that's what she knew, and that's what she told Clint Curtis. And that's what he has in his sworn affidavit.
He had a lot of political theory about, you don't have to actually beat the Democrats in the Democratic area, you just have to reduce the margin enough so overall it weakens it. and you win that way. And he's just a wild man. I mean, he was willing to do anything to win. And I'm thinking, well, these people are crooked, but they're probably crazy. No one's going to sit by and let them do this anyway. You know, they tried to bribe me to come back to them. Eventually it got up to, $1 million. They'll give me $1 million to come back. Then it was $1 million to just leave Tallahassee. And Feeney will get me a job anywhere I want to work. Anywhere. Name the price, name the location, you're there. Now that you've got your vote and you want to flip it, you hit the R, hit the S, and it flips. Bush wins.
That's simple.
That's simple. 24 lines of code, you never see it. Kind of felt responsible, like I wrote a blueprint for him. Not that I'm the only one in the world who could do that, Any baby programmer would know how to do that. It is super easy. It takes nothing. It's just some hidden buttons on a screen. You hit the little hidden buttons. It gives 51% to the guy you want to win, gives the other 49. So it doesn't matter how you vote, the machine votes for you.
So in other words, there is absolutely no assurance whatsoever on anything with regard to these machines?
Absolutely none, unless you look at the source code and make sure it's safe before it goes in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Mathers. I know that Congresswoman Waters has...
In 2006, Princeton University's Center for Information Technology Policy performed a security analysis of the Diebold AccuVote TS voting machine. The main findings of the security analysis were as follows. Malicious software running on a single voting machine can steal votes with little, if any, risk of detection. The malicious software can modify all of the records, audit logs, and counters kept by the voting machine, so that even careful forensic examination of these records will find nothing amiss. We have constructed demonstration software that carries out this vote-stealing attack. Anyone who has physical access to a voting machine or memory card will later be inserted into the machine can install said malicious software using a simple method that takes as little as 1 minute. In practice, poll workers and others often have unsupervised access to the machines. AccuVote TS machines are susceptible to voting machine computer viruses that can spread malicious software automatically and invisibly from machine to machine during normal pre- and post-election activities. We have constructed a demonstration virus that spreads in this way, installing our demonstration vote-stealing program on every machine it infects. While some of these problems can be eliminated by improving Diebold software, others cannot be remedied without replacing the machine's hardware. Changes to the election procedures would also be required to ensure security. Diebold responded to the study, stating, Diebold strongly disagrees with the conclusion of the Princeton report. Secure voting equipment, proper procedures, and adequate testing assure an accurate voting process that has been confirmed through numerous stringent accuracy tests and third-party security analysis. Every voter in every local jurisdiction that uses AccuVote TS should feel secure knowing that their vote will count on Election Day. A number of third-party security analyses were also done on the AccuVote TS, such as the Hopkins-Rice report, the SAIC report, the RABA report, the CompuWare report. And like the Princeton report, they all came to the conclusion that the AccuVote TS has serious security problems. Something else worth noting is that the computer code that counts our votes is a private trade secret. That means that the company such as Diebold creates the code that counts our votes and does not have to release that code to the public, opening up the door to potential tampering. In the 2016 Democratic primary election, states that had a paper trail preferred Sanders over Clinton 51% to 49%. However, in states without a paper trail, Clinton was preferred 65% to Sanders 35%. Exit polls versus final results. In the 2016 presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, exit poll data compiled from 28 states showed significant discrepancies between the exit polls and the final results. In Ohio, there was an 8.5% discrepancy 5.9% in North Carolina, 5.6% in Pennsylvania, 4.9% in Wisconsin, and 2.6% in Florida, all outside the margin of error, which is 2%. In emerging democracies, exit polls are used in order to find any manipulation in the voting system. It also provides a double check to the whole vote, which improves transparency. A vote is usually considered accurate if the exit polling data is within 2% of the actual results. While swings in the general election of 8.5% are bad, exit poll discrepancies were even greater in the primaries, where there were swings as high as 14%. In all states except two, Wisconsin and Oklahoma, the final results were in Clinton's favor during the 2016 Democratic primary. Collusion between the two parties. It should be made clear that election fraud has taken place and that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have benefited from massive election fraud in the primaries and the general election. Trump is a fraud, as was Clinton. In fact, both of their families have been close for quite some time. Bill Clinton and Donald Trump shared a golf game and a cordial chat shortly before Trump decided to run. Ivanka Trump and Chelsea Clinton are also good friends. However, they only put their friendship on ice after the 2016 elections. Trump also gave $250,000 to the Clinton Foundation. Trump and Clinton also share the same Delaware tax loophole address with 285,000 other firms. Bill Clinton also appointed Donald Trump's sister to the United States Court of Appeals in 1999. WikiLeaks leaked John Podesta emails reveal that Hillary Clinton's presidential strategy included elevating Trump as a Pied Piper candidate. The following video is of Donald Trump praising Hillary Clinton in 2012.
Hillary Clinton, I think, is a terrific woman. I mean, I'm a little biased because I've known her for years. I live in New York. She lives in New York. And I've known her and her husband for years, and I really like them both a lot. And I think she really works hard. And I think she, again, she's given an agenda that's not all of her, but I think she really works hard, and I think she does a good job, and I like her.
Do you think that she says she's out at the end of this term? You think we're going to see her again running for office?
I think so. I think, assuming she's healthy, which I hope she will be, I think she probably runs after the next 4 years, I would imagine.
You support her?
I don't want to get into this because I'll get myself into trouble. But
that's why I asked you, to see if we get into trouble.
I just like her. I like her, and I like her husband. Her husband made a speech on Monday at Mar-a-Lago, and it was very well received. And he's a really good guy, and she's a really good person and woman.
When moving forward, we need to not simply replace one fraud with another, but rather to transform a system that makes fraud into an essential component rather than a rare occurrence. The system of representative democracy as we know it produces fraud as the norm rather than the exception. The problem with the system we've got, though, is that it relies on the corrupt officials to reform themselves. The voters have no direct power to overturn decisions made by these corrupt officials. At this time, many in the United States are whipped up into a state of hysteria around Russia, claiming that Russia hacked our elections in a conspiracy to get Donald Trump elected to be president. 13 Russian nationals, including Vladimir Putin's chef, have been indicted as a result of this hysteria. Shortly after the 2016 presidential elections, Vladimir Putin made the claim that Russia did not tamper in our elections.
I have repeatedly made statements on that. If you want me to say it again, okay, I'll do that. Every attempt by the current administration, by the leadership of the Democratic Party, to find a scapegoat for its failures, well, I have a number of ideas on that. We know that the Democratic Party lost not just the presidential election. They lost the Senate elections, they lost the Congress elections. Well, is this... I'm to blame? Well, are we responsible for everything? Are we the scapegoats? It just signals that the current administration has systemic problems. I spoke about that at the Valdai Discussion Club. There's a gap between the perceptions of what is good and bad with the elites and the perception with the grassroots. The fact that 30% of Republican voters support a Russian president. Well, I'm not to be thanked for that. It means that the vast majority of the US population, have the same ideas of the world order, of the threats and challenges, common threats and challenges. And this is good, that there are people who share our traditional values. This could help us to build better relations between such powerful countries as Russia and the US. This is a good foundation. People have a liking towards each other. They share the values. Well, it's not good to recall former presidents. I think Mr. Reagan would not roll in his grave, but he would rather rejoice at the fact that his party is winning across the board, and certainly he would be happy that the new president has been elected. Certainly only we knew that he's going to win. None except us believed he's going to win. Now, if you look at the legendary Democratic leaders, they would roll into their graves like Mr. Roosevelt. Even in the most difficult times of the Great Depression, at the end of the 90s and during World War II, he united the nation. The current administration has split the nation. And the call on the electors not to vote for Trump is a step towards dividing the nation. And two electors didn't vote for Trump, and for Hillary there were 4 electors that didn't vote for Hillary. So even on this, the Democratic Party lost, and I think that's a blow to them. It's a humiliation for them. If you lose, you need to lose with dignity. So I would like to have, both with the newly elected president and with the leader of the Democratic Party, to have business-like constructive relationship that would serve the best interests of the US and Russia.
Whether Russia interfered in our election or not, it doesn't matter, because the mechanisms remain in place for our own government officials, both political parties, corporate media, billionaires, and big money to rig the election process, and it has been in place for a long time. It's not Russia doing it, it's us doing it to ourselves, but many Americans are too afraid to look in the mirror. Maybe they'd see a country that pretends to be another country. Maybe if they did look in the mirror, they'd be inspired to take direct action and correct the wrongs of a corrupt election system. Whether your vote is counted accurately or not, it's extremely important to get directly involved yourself on the issues that you and your community cares about. If you won't do it, who will? Thank you for joining us for another edition of Separation of Corporation and State. We will continue to make further videos in other topic areas of how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are similar in most ways, and work together for the most part. Thank you.